Have you ever heard of ICM photography, intentional camera movement? It's where we actually jiggle our cameras to get a shot using a slow shutter speed. Well, let's take a look at my first two attempts and how that turned out and some of the things I learned. Okay, I went out recently with my X Pro 3 to do some intentional camera movement photography, or ICM photography. And I had to make some adjustments, I had to think about it, how to work the shutter speeds and everything else. So I thought, you know what, and make a good movie to discuss, my learning experience and doing ICM for the first time. Well, the first thing I learned is that the X Pro 3 is a lousy camera to use for ICM. This back panel, the back screen, the way it works, really works against ICM. Having a viewfinder off to the left instead of in the middle also works against ICM. You really want to be using the rear screen for a lot of it. And a central viewfinder is a good idea as well. And especially if you're trying to do anything that's rotational. So what else did I use? Well, I've had my 27mm lens on it, and I had a neutral density filter which is adjustable. You can see it runs from max to minimum, and it runs from ND2 to ND400. So that's quite a range. And I set the lens at f22. My shutter speed was either 1/2 or 1/4, and my ISO was 160. Now, I also did some shooting with my 23mm Voigtlander, and I did not have a variable neutral density filter. This is an ND64, and it wasn't quite enough. So I ended up with a few shots were a little bit overexposed because this lens only goes to f16. And so as a consequence, I couldn't darken it down enough, reduce the exposure enough for bright sunlight. If I had been able to get down to f22, I probably wouldn't have had a problem. As far as shutter speeds are concerned, 1/2 and 1/4 worked well. I tried a few shots at 1 second, but they ended up too blurry. Now, some of the things I did, and we'll talk about it as we go through some of my images, is that I would take a shot and then try to gauge the timing of the shutter release so I could move the camera right at the very end. So I would have a shot that was mostly sharp with streaks or some other artifacts going on that added some appeal. I also tried some street photography with it, kind of not so successful. I don't know whether I'll throw up a shot of those or not if I find one when I get back up into my office. I'll see if I can find one that's worth putting up. But the rest of it was interesting, and a lot of what I did was based on trying to time up the shutter release so I could get, most of the shot relatively sharp and then just some blur at the end or two positions. So for example, there's a bridge that appeared to be in two places at the same time. Stuff like that. That's what I tried to do. So let's go look at these images and discuss, how I went about it and what I learned from the experience. Okay, this is my first attempt at street photography. Getting a photo of a cyclist, it didn't really work. So that's something I'm going to have to work on. The point I want to make here is I was using my X Pro 3 that does not have IBIS. So I would suggest if you have a camera body with IBIS, make sure it's off. I think it's probably cliche that if you're doing ICM, you have at least one forced path in there. This was a case of using a 1/2 second shutter speed and moving the camera near the end of the exposure. Again, this is 1/2 a second. And I moved it right at the very end of the exposure just so most of the building is relatively sharp and you just get the blur at the end, and I tilted it by rotating on the bottom end of the camera. This is an old railway bridge, again around 1/2 a second, and I moved the camera vertically rather slowly to sort of elongate the opening of the bridge and give it kind of a haunted look. I wanted this bridge shot to sort of have two separate positions, so I kept the camera more or less steady at the beginning and at the end of the exposure and moved it quickly in between. I wanted to give the effect of an earthquake on these columns, so I held the camera by the bottom and rotated the top to give it sort of a side-to-side shake effect. I think it worked out pretty good. Here I was standing on a bridge taking photos of cars going by. In this case, I tracked the vehicle to a certain extent, but I also let it go by quite quickly. I think I was running at about a quarter of a second here. And I got an interesting effect from the spectral highlights on the alloy wheels. Here I was tracking the car, so the bridge was blurred out. The car is relatively sharp at the front end, but we still got a trace of blur at the back, which I think looks rather cool. In this shot of a footbridge, I've kept the camera more or less steady and then moved it right at the very end of the exposure so as to create that streak in the sky, and I think that turned out quite well. Okay, there was my first couple attempts at intentional camera movement photography. Some of the things I took away from the experience is that rangefinder cameras are not a good solution for it. You need something more like a DSLR style, a mirrorless camera with a central viewfinder and a good screen. Manual focus on the lenses. You don't want your autofocus working. You want your IBIS turned off, though I imagine it might produce an interesting result if you left it on. Something to experiment with. I also found that the variable density, neutral density filters were very useful. I could control my exposure just by moving that neutral density filter. So it gave me the opportunity to make some rather precise adjustments, stepless adjustments to exposure. So that was quite cool. Working with a single standard neutral density filter is more cumbersome. And ND64 I found on a bright sunny day wasn't always enough. I could have gone one more. So I would recommend a variable neutral density filter, not a standard one. Other than that, it's a lot of fun. One of the other things I tried to do is vary my movements according to the timing of the shutter, opening and closing, to get more of it more or less sharp and only some of it blurred, and try different types of motions, rotating the camera, moving it up and down, both vertical and horizontal, that sort of thing. You play with it. The other thing I found, which was very handy, is I turned the image review on continuous. So as soon as I took the shot, up would come the image in the viewfinder or in the screen, and you could see what you got for that shot, and then you could proceed to take another one and adjust. That process of taking a shot, make an adjustment, take a shot, make an adjustment, it worked very well. And I put the preview on continuous, so I'm always looking at the last shot, and I can judge what I have to do to get the effect I want. I think that was probably the most useful piece of learning that I did, was to make sure that continuous preview was always on, because normally I have preview off because I'm not much of a chimper. I don't look at my shots right away. So putting that on made a big difference, and I would suggest that would be one of the things. If you're not in the habit of having preview on, or display on, or your image display on, turn it on. Other than that, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I wouldn't do it all the time. You can overdo it, but as a change of pace kind of photography, it's cool. So give it a try. Cheers.